Imagine you are sitting across from someone in a really quiet room, and they ask you to play a simple game.
Right.
They say a word, and you have to reply with the very first word that pops into your head. So they say tree, you say green.
Yeah, exactly.
They say water, you say lake. It feels entirely effortless. I mean, it feels like you are completely in control of your own thoughts, right? You just, reach into your mental vocabulary, pick the obvious response, and say it.
It absolutely feels that way. I mean, we walk around operating under the assumption that our conscious minds are, well, firmly in the driver's seat, steering every conversation and curating every single reaction.
But a fraction of a second of hesitation between tree and green is actually all it takes to expose a secret you didn't even know you were keeping. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore these early word association studies that basically prove our conscious minds aren't actually pulling the strings.
Right, the precise delay, down to a fifth of a second, between a prompt and your response serves as a direct window into the unconscious.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's a wild concept.
It is a profound realization. By measuring the precise reaction times of subjects during these tests, early psychologists discovered that those little delays, those, split-second verbal hesitations, they are incredibly deliberate.
They aren't just random pauses where you happen to be searching for a word.
Exactly. They are the exact fingerprints of an unconscious mind actively intervening in your thought process.
Which completely upends how we think about free will in our daily conversations. But to understand how a tiny hesitation exposes a massive secret, we really have to look at the methodology.
Yeah, the setup is key here.
Because my mind immediately jumped to the assumption that they must have used incredibly complex laboratory setups to measure something this minute. Like, I'm picturing dark rooms, electrodes, massive chronoscopes.
Yeah, well, they deliberately avoided all of that. The researchers realized early on that putting a subject, especially someone who might already be psychologically fragile, into a high-tech, intimidating laboratory environment would just flood the data with artificial anxiety.
The clunky apparatus itself would become the distraction.
Right. So they stripped the entire experiment down to its barest, most unassuming form.
They used a simple 1/5 of a second stopwatch. Just click, say a word, click, record the time.
Yeah.
It's so elegant. Instead of diffusing some massive psychological bomb, it's more like they built a seismograph for the mind. Just a simple, quiet needle designed to catch completely invisible emotional tremors.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Yeah.
And this simplicity allowed them to gather thousands upon thousands of these stopwatch measurements in a relatively natural setting. And through that massive data set, they established a universal baseline.
Which was what?
Across all their subjects,
Yep.
the average reaction time to a standard, non-threatening stimulus word was 1.8 seconds.
And just to clarify the math on that, because, anytime you calculate an average with human behavior, you run into the problem of the outliers.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if a subject gets distracted by a fly in the room and takes 10 seconds to answer lake, they didn't just use a standard mean to calculate the baseline, right?
Right. What's fascinating here is that by using the median rather than the arithmetical mean, they effectively scrubbed out those massive outliers. That is what leaves that rock-solid baseline of 1.8 seconds.
Okay, that makes sense. The median protected the core data from random, meaningless distractions.
Precisely. But what's really intriguing is what happened when they started slicing that baseline across different demographics. They found that highly educated subjects reacted slightly faster, hovering around 1.5 seconds.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Meanwhile, less educated subjects were closer to 2.0 seconds. And they also noted a general trend of men reacting faster than women in this specific testing environment.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
If the experimenter is a highly educated man in the early 1900s, sitting across from, say, an uneducated woman, the power dynamics in that room are going to be intensely skewed.
Oh, without a doubt.
Doesn't that intimidation factor make the stopwatch data incredibly noisy? Like, how do the researchers know a delay is a hidden secret and not just a subject being incredibly nervous or, annoyed by the guy holding the timer?
That is a crucial distinction to make, and it's something the researchers actually accounted for. They fully acknowledged that those demographic differences weren't measuring raw intelligence or cognitive processing speed.
They weren't.
No, they were measuring emotional inhibition. The power dynamic in the room acts as an atmospheric dampener. The subject feels intimidated, so they overthink, they self-censor slightly, and the baseline slows down.
Oh.
But, and this answers your question, The baseline is relative. Even if someone's general intimidation slows their normal response down to 2 seconds, the researchers aren't looking at the 2 seconds. They're looking for the explosive spikes that suddenly jump to 4, 5, or 6 seconds relative to that individual's normal rhythm.
Oh, I see. So the general nervousness just sets a new floor. The actual secrets are the massive deviations from whatever floor the subject happens to be standing on.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the baseline is perfectly established, then a sudden 5-second delay isn't a math error. It's a fundamental failure of the brain's retrieval system. What exactly is blocking the word from coming out?
The researchers coined a term for this invisible roadblock. They called it the feeling-toned complex.
Here's where it gets really interesting, the feeling tone complex. What is actually happening, physically or psychologically, when someone hits one of these complexes?
Think of a complex as a dense, gravitational cluster of images, memories, and ideas, all glued together by a very strong, unresolved emotion. It could be guilt, it could be desire, it could be a deep-seated fear. When the experimenter casually drops a stimulus word that happens to brush up against that complex, the emotional energy of it flares up.
So the conscious mind wants to just blurt out the easiest association, but the unconscious recognizes the threat and hits the brakes.
Exactly. That internal friction, that traffic jam between what you want to say and what the complex is trying to hide, is what causes the reaction time to slow down so drastically.
And it's fascinating that this delay is almost entirely emotional, not intellectual. I mean, when they looked at the numbers, 83% of those prolonged delays were entirely driven by the word hitting an emotional nerve.
Yeah, that's a huge majority.
Only 17% caused delays simply because the stimulus word was rare or intellectually difficult to parse. Like, if I hesitate on the word apple, it's almost certainly not because my brain is struggling to remember what an apple is.
Yeah.
It's because some specific memory involving an apple is setting off alarm bells in my unconscious.
Exactly. And the subject sitting in the chair is almost always completely oblivious to this internal battle. They just feel a strange momentary blankness. There is a concept from these findings that illustrates this beautifully, that ego consciousness, which is our waking, reasoning self, is merely the marionette that dances on the stage.
Wow.
It is moved by a concealed mechanism.
You really have to stop and think about the gravity of that. We
Yeah.
construct these entire identities based on the idea that we are rational actors choosing our words carefully, but a simple stopwatch proves that you are merely a marionette.
Yeah, it's unsettling.
The unconscious is down in the dark, pulling the strings, and it will literally force you to betray the exact things you were trying to conceal just by dragging out a syllable or causing a tiny stutter.
Here we can actually see this internal traffic jam play out with astonishing clarity in the source material. The research profiles a married woman whose baseline was incredibly fast. She was averaging just 1.0 second per word.
Right, so she is absolutely breezing through the test. The rhythm is flawless. They say head, she says scarf. They say green, she says grass. Click, click, click.
Just knocking them out.
Yeah, the conscious mind is fully in control, effortlessly handing out the folders. But then the experimenter says the word stork.
And the mental machinery just completely seizes up.
She sits there in silence for an agonizing 3.4 seconds before finally blurting out the words to bring. For someone whose baseline is exactly 1 second, 3.4 seconds is an eternity.
It is a massive anomaly. When the researchers gently probed the context of this delay afterward, they discovered the word stork had collided head-on with a sprawling hidden pregnancy complex.
No!
The subject was, in fact, pregnant, but she was harboring a deep, agonizing anxiety about the child she was carrying. To her conscious mind, she was just trying to play a word game.
But to her unconscious, the word stork was a glaring spotlight thrown directly onto her deepest fears about motherhood and her marriage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And her unconscious went to extreme lengths to handle that spotlight. Later in the exact same test, the experimenter gives her the stimulus word despise.
Oh, this part is wild.
Yeah, she freezes for 1.8 seconds, which is nearly double her baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And then she replies, but she replies in French. She says, méprisé.
Wait, she switches languages entirely.
That is one of the most remarkable defense mechanisms documented in the research. Why switch languages? Because the word despise struck a very specific nerve.
Right.
She held a terrifying, unspoken fear that her pregnancy would physically alter her, causing her husband to despise her and lose regard for her. This specific fear was deeply entangled with a French novel she had read, Vérité by Émile Zola, which featured an estranged couple.
So the moment she hears the word despise, the unconscious realizes that answering in her native tongue is going to bring that marital terror right to the surface of her mind. So it builds a linguistic firewall. It forces her to translate the concept into French to create a buffer of emotional distance. She literally uses a foreign language to shield her own ego from the immediate sting of the word.
The complexity of that split-second decision is staggering, if you think about it. The unconscious has to recognize the threat, search the memory banks for an alternative, formulate the French translation, and push it to the mouth, all in 1.8 seconds.
It's incredible.
But doing that heavy lifting takes a toll.
Yes, because after the spike, she doesn't just instantly recover. I was reading that part and thinking of it like a severe emotional hangover.
An emotional hangover is a highly accurate way to describe it. The scientific phenomenon occurring here is called perseveration.
Let's talk about the mechanics of perseveration, because it proves just how physical these emotional blocks really are.
Right, so perseveration occurs when the feeling tone of a disturbing word lingers in the mind, essentially consuming all available cognitive bandwidth.
Like background apps draining your battery.
Exactly. The subject gets hit with a heavy, complex, triggering word like stork. The alarm bells go off, the delay happens, the answer is forced out. But the unconscious is still operating in a state of high alert.
Yeah.
So when the experimenter says the very next word, which might be something completely innocent like table, her reaction time is still abnormally slow.
The processing power required to handle the threat of the stork leaves absolutely zero RAM left in the brain to process a table. The emotion from the previous word echoes into the present. It proves you can't just snap your fingers and clear out emotional baggage.
Exactly. The mind needs time to flush the adrenaline of the complex out of the system.
Now, this linguistic firewall doesn't just happen with a single, isolated fear like pregnancy. What happens when a mind is juggling a whole web of overlapping anxieties? Because the research profiles a second subject, a highly educated middle-aged doctor with a baseline of 1.2 seconds.
Right.
But unlike the first subject, his psyche is an absolute minefield.
He was a fascinating case study in competing anxieties. The analysis revealed he was carrying around 10 independent feeling tone complexes just under the surface.
10? Wow.
Yeah, and one of the most dominant ones was a severe money complex. He was drowning in hidden financial worries and debt.
Which leads to my absolute favorite anomaly in the entire study, because it sounds like a joke, but it's a profound neurological slip. The experimenter gives the doctor the stimulus word tooth, which in German is Zahn. And the doctor immediately replies with the word money, which is Geld. He associates a tooth with money.
It makes no logical sense until you understand the phenomenon of repressive assimilation.
Okay, what is that?
Well, the subject heard the phonetic sound of the word Zahn, but his unconscious mind, completely obsessed with his financial ruin, hijacked his auditory processing. It assimilated the word Zahn into the structurally similar word Zahlen, which means to pay.
Wait, hold on. His money complex literally overwrote his hearing. Is the brain actually capable of mishearing a word on purpose just to fit an anxiety? It seems almost hallucinatory.
It borders on it, yes. The unconscious pattern matching system operates significantly faster than conscious auditory comprehension.
Wow.
So before his conscious mind could even parse the concept of a tooth, the dominant money complex stepped in, analyzed the phonetic sound, flagged it as relevant to his debt, and forced the reaction money. The anxiety is so loud it deafens him to reality.
That is just incredible. And we see this exact same doctor use his unconscious not just to obsess over his debt, but to actively run away from his past. The experimenter gives him the word fire, which in German is brand.
Right.
And the doctor replies with see, mir, fire to see.
This is perhaps the clearest example of the unconscious mind acting as an active sensor. For this specific doctor, the word brand fire was a direct, painful trigger to a memory of acute alcoholism he had suffered from. The word carries the connotation of a burning thirst, or the physical burning of liquor.
Oh, I see. So the moment the word hits his ear, the unconscious recognizes a massive psychological threat. It knows that acknowledging the true meaning of brand will drag up immense shame, guilt, and the trauma of his addiction.
Precisely. So the internal sensor steps in and performs a miraculous bit of linguistic gymnastics. Automatically, instantaneously, the mind shifts the word brand to the compound word branding, which means surf or breaking waves.
That's wild.
And from surf, it safely and logically arrives at the reaction word sea.
It built an emergency escape route. Fire morphs into surf. Surf leads to sea. It censored his own memory before his conscious ego could even feel a drop of the shame. This completely shifts the definition of the unconscious from a passive storage unit where we just bury bad memories into an active, dynamic bodyguard that is constantly steering the conscious mind away from trauma.
And doing it in a fifth of a second. It is a masterful, if slightly misguided, protective mechanism.
Okay, so we've got pregnant women throwing up French firewalls and doctors using linguistic gymnastics to hide their alcoholism and debt. But the obvious question is, how does this apply to the rest of us?
That's the big question.
For those of us who aren't sitting in a clinical setting with a guy holding a stopwatch, how do these complexes leak out?
They leak out constantly in the form of everyday automatisms. Slips of the tongue, misread words, or bizarre obsessive thoughts that seem to come from nowhere. There is a wonderfully relatable anecdote in the text about a woman who fell victim to a highly persistent complex disguised as a geographic trivia question.
Yes, the Taganrog incident. This is the perfect example of the unconscious acting like a frustrated child throwing a tantrum.
The woman in question found herself completely unable to stop thinking about the name of a Russian city, Taganrog. It was just stuck in her head, looping over and over again for days.
And she had no ties to Russia, no reason to be thinking of it. It's like having a pop song stuck in your head, but it's just a random municipality on the Sea of Azov. What Taganrog?
Well, the researchers asked her to examine any repressed wishes or minor frustrations she'd recently experienced. After some probing, she admitted that she had been dropping hints to her husband, desperately wanting him to buy her a specific type of housecoat. The German word for that housecoat is Morgenrock.
Morgenrogs.
Taganrog. It is so absurd and yet makes total mechanical sense.
Her husband ignores the hint about the housecoat. Her conscious ego decides to play it cool and suppress the disappointment so she doesn't seem petty. But the unconscious mind, sitting down in the dark, absolutely refuses to let the slight go.
It refuses to let it go, but it also has to bypass the conscious mind's rule against complaining. So it finds a phonetic cipher, a word that sounds almost exactly the same, Morgenrock, Taganrog, and just plays it on an infinite loop.
That is hilarious.
It really highlights how incredibly persistent our unfulfilled desires are. If you deny them direct expression, they will find a loophole, even if they have to disguise themselves as a Russian city to bypass the censor.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all these threads together, from kitchen timers mapping the mind's fault lines to French novels, auditory hallucinations about debt and Russian housecoats, the profound takeaway is that our command of language is an illusion.
It really is.
The specific words we choose and the exact fraction of a second we take to choose them are a direct, undeniable window into the secrets we are keeping, even from ourselves.
It completely reframes how you should view your own mind. The next time you experience a bizarre slip of the tongue, or you find yourself humming a random tune for no reason, or you completely freeze up, when someone asks you a seemingly innocent question at dinner, do not just dismiss it as a mental glitch.
Right.
That is your own personal network of feeling tone complexes taking the wheel. Your unconscious is actively speaking to you, trying to manage an emotion you haven't dealt with.
It's your marionette strings getting tangled up just long enough for you to notice them. And I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, building on the sheer mechanics of everything we've explored today.
Okay.
Over a century ago, early psychologists proved that a simple, clunky, 1/5 of a second stopwatch could uncover our deepest shames, our hidden debts, and our unfulfilled desires, just by timing a slight hesitation in our voices. Now, think about the digital age we live in. Think about the smartphone in your pocket or the keyboard you type on every single day. Those devices don't just passively record what you type. They are highly tuned seismographs. They track your typing speed, your micro-hesitations, your deleted texts, and the precise pauses between your keystrokes down to the millisecond.
That is terrifying to think about.
We are leaving a trail of digital hesitations every time we communicate. If a kitchen timer could map the darkest corners of the unconscious mind 100 years ago, what are the screens in our pockets currently learning about the secrets we don't even know we're keeping?